We are back. Last time we talked about Andrew Jackson invading Florida during the War of 1812 and the Battle of Pensacola. So now we're up to 1816, and there is a fort on the Apalachicola River, which has been built by the British and manned by the British. Actually, was originally built by the Spanish, but called eventually will be called Fort Gadsden when it's rebuilt by the Americans, but called the Negro Fort. And Andrew Jackson complained directly to the Spanish in 1816 about this fort because it was in fact harboring runaway slaves. And the runaway slaves, many of them had been given commissions in the British Army. And this goes along with the Jeffersonian view that any place harboring runaway slaves was a problem and that Florida had to be acquired and a pretext had to be created to acquire Florida because of the runaway slave question and the need to expand agrarian Jeffersonian slavery. The U.S. then builds a fort under Andrew Jackson, who was a general by this time, Fort Scott, which is right on the Georgia-Florida line, near where the confluence of the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, and Flint rivers are. By the way, you can read about all of this in my book, The American Conquest of Florida. And I think this is the last video which is going to correspond with that book. The future videos will be new material that's not in that book. Supplying the fort became problematic because you would have convoys that came up the Apalachicola River. There was free navigation of rivers by treaty between Spain and Florida. And of course, at this point, Florida is still in Spanish hands, even though the British had been given basically a free hand in Spain for a part of that period. And the ships were being attacked by this fort, which was manned by runaway slaves. The fort was occupied at the time by about 330 people, with the experience of many of them being colonial Marines, which is pretty significant when we talk about this situation. At this point, James Madison, there he is still the president of the United States. And Madison is concerned, again, about runaway slaves and wants to expand American territory. And these African Americans, the 330 or so that are there, as I said, many of them were trained British officers. Many of them had fought with the British. And they were led by an African American named Prince, who had been an officer in the British Army. And in fact, the British had left the fort fully armed. They had left the fort completely with provisions, etc., because they wanted these African Americans to be able to fight off the Americans. So they didn't just abandon the fort at the end of the War of 1812. Well, they did, but they didn't. They certainly left it in a defensible position. Long story short, the United States creates a pretext for an attack. They attack. They kill just about everybody because one of the bombardments from the Apalachicola River from the U.S. ship hits the fort's magazine, which was loaded, and spectacular incident. You can read more about this in my book. You can listen to several episodes of the Florida History Podcast where we've talked about this. I want to skip ahead to Jackson then the following year invading Florida, or actually in 1817, there were some skirmishes. And in November of 1817, General Gaines sent U.S. troops into the village of Foultown, which was a Miccosukee village. And by this time, James Monroe is the president, and there is a new administration for Monroe, which includes Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who we're going to talk about in a minute, and Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, who we're going to talk about in a minute. And these two gentlemen are going to reverse the role that we envisioned them in history. That's what makes this so fascinating. But before that happens, Andrew Jackson invades Florida. He captures the village of Miccosukee, which is in Leon County, and had been the capital of the state of Muskogee, which was also a British-aligned breakaway Native American state for many years, which, again, we haven't covered in this series, but is covered in my latest book. And he invades, captures St. Mark's, captures 2 British officers and executes them, and creates an international incident. Long story short, I don't want to get into the exact specifics of the campaign. Again, if you're interested, you can read it in my book, The American Conquest of Florida. So let's move to the reaction to this incident, because this is very important in the discussion of Jeffersonian Florida and Jeffersonian principles in Florida. John Quincy Adams, he's on your screen right now. He would later become an adversary of Jackson. He would later become the great fighter of slavery after he was president, when he went back into the House of Representatives. But at this point, he is Jackson's great defender in the cabinet. Jackson has broken international law. He has invaded Spanish territory. He has executed 2 British officers, captured 2 British officers who were aiding the Seminole. He has also conducted himself in just a rogue manner, capturing Spanish forts. And he was heavily defended by Adams, who said the U.S. was defending its interests against the natives, that being the Seminoles, who, ironically, again, 20 years later, John Quincy Adams would be decrying the U.S. treatment of the Seminoles in the Florida territory. But at this point, Adams was more Jeffersonian than he was like his father, John Adams, or his mother, Abigail Adams. And the British. He said Jackson's protecting American interests against the British. So this creates a crisis in official Washington circles. Now, meanwhile, John C. Calhoun, who would later be the great Southern defender, the foremost defender of slavery in the Republic, and the most influential defender of slavery and the South's interests in the Republic, and the clear heir to Jefferson's legacy, was opposing Jackson. In fact, Calhoun, as the Secretary of War, said he didn't like that Jackson had violated international law, and he felt like he had not authorized the full 1817 invasion once it started. And once Jackson crossed the line, he figured he would just engage in some skirmishes and then leave Florida. But he didn't. Calhoun wanted to give Pensacola and St. Mark's, which had been captured by Jackson, back to Spain, and was very, very unhappy about the way Jackson conducted himself, although he did defend the executions of the 2 British officers, because he said the British were causing all of these problems and effectively was an Anglophobe. In fact, I have his direct quote for us. He claimed, "Wickedness, corruption, and barbarity at which the heart sickens, and which in this enlightened age it ought not to scarcely believe that a Christian nation, that being Great Britain, would have participated." He also claimed Great Britain, who by false promises delude and excite an Indian tribe to the deeds of a savage war. So he's blaming the British for the Seminoles' behavior. And in fact, the British had armed the Seminole for years, and as I mentioned earlier, the state of Muskogee, which had been kind of this Seminole Creek, Miccosukee, Muskogee breakaway state, had been armed by the British. And in fact, there had been British bureaucrats who had given them aid in terms of how to form a government and administer certain services. That's not that relevant to our discussion. That's why I haven't gotten into the state of Muskogee, but it's a fascinating topic. I think it's something that people should explore further, honestly, if you're interested. It really is a thing. But at this point, the American press is hungry for Florida. They're pro-slavery, and they are really excited about the idea of capturing Florida, extending slavery, subjugating the natives, returning the African Americans that have run away back to slavery. This is what the Savannah Journal wrote at the time. The Savannah Journal wrote, "It was not to be expected that an establishment of so pernicious to the southern states holding out as part of their population temptations to insubordination would have suffered to exist after the close of the war, that being the War of 1812. In the course of the last winter, several slaves from this neighborhood fled to Florida. Others have lately gone from Tennessee and the Mississippi Territory. How long shall this evil requiring immediate remedy be permitted to exist? So freeing slaves is evil, and moral behavior is extending slavery and creating the elements for a Jeffersonian extension, manifest destiny of slavery and Jeffersonianism. So that, along with this, from Andrew Jackson: British influence in Florida must be destroyed, or we will have the whole tribe of Indians to fight and slave insurrectionists to quell in the southern states. All of this is being said at the time. So long story short, Spain and Adams, who you saw earlier, de Onís is the Spanish minister, they agree to a treaty in which Florida buys the United States buys Florida from Spain, and Florida becomes an American territory in 1821, and Andrew Jackson is the first territorial governor. Doesn't go so well for Jackson as territorial governor, but the important thing to note is that Florida, by hook or by crook, has now become part of the United States, and as a result, the ability to crush the natives, the ability to extend slavery, the ability to elect more members of Congress who are Southern Democrats and who will oppose the abolitionists in Congress. And this becomes a much bigger thing in the 1830s. I would say the late 1830s is when you began to see Northern interests really begin to say, okay, time out on slavery. Prior to that, even though the northern states, most of the northern states had abolished slavery, I don't think it was a big political issue. They tolerated it in the South. But Florida becoming part of the Union is going to help change that dynamic. And that's something we're going to pick up with next time in Jeffersonian Florida.